Round 5 team lists have dropped, and there's some big gun players returning back from injury. Let's see who's made the team. Hey everyone, welcome back to another video from A Man Talks NRL SuperCoach. Today's video we're going to be going through the team list Tuesdays for round 5, as well as my top captain options for this week. There are, as I mentioned, some big gun players returning back from injury and a lot of changes that we need to go through, so let's get straight into the video. I will put another separate video together on trade targets and going through player prices and break-evens, so definitely stay tuned for that one in the next coming days. So I just want to give a quick shout out to our round 4 top scorer in our overall group league, Jesse, with a name that I love in getting an absolutely massive 1,564 this week, and that puts them into the top 600 overall ranking, which is an absolutely amazing effort. And with our top 5, we've got James, Paul, Stuart, Jesse, and Benny, all sitting in the top 5 and all in the top 1,000. So they're all doing really super well. If you guys do want to get into the overall group league, I'll leave a code for that in the description below as well. So let's get into the teams. So the first game of the round will be the Rabbitohs taking on the Broncos. Some notable changes here for the Rabbitohs obviously will be the lack of Cody Walker this week, given that he's got that 1 week suspension, and Keon Koloamatangi also has a 2 week ban. So in replacement, we've got Benji Marshall filling in straight into that number 6 slot, and we've also got Dean Hawkins moving on to the bench, with Jacob Host also moving into the starting pack in replacement for Koloamatangi. Apart from that, no real changes at the Rabbitohs, and I think a lot of people are going to be expecting a bit of a cricket score in this game, given how well the Rabbitohs are playing and how poorly the Broncos are. It will be interesting to see how the Rabbitohs play without Cody Walker. I'd expect more involvement, from the likes of Benji Marshall and Latrell as well. They're so lucky that they've got someone like Benji, who they can just slot straight into their team, and I don't really expect too much of a drop off in the way they attack, especially coming up against a pretty poor Broncos team. With the Broncos, the main changes for them are that Pat Carrigan and Herbie Farnworth are out of the side. Pat Carrigan has got a 1 week ban for a crusher tackle, so he'll be coming back straight in, you'd expect, from round 6, and Herbie Farnworth has picked up an injury. So in replacement, we've got Richie Kenner taking Farnworth's centre spot, and Tavita Pangai Jr. moving back into the starting lineup after being benched last week. There were a lot of question marks over TPJ's benching last week. He had an amazing start to the season with those first 3 games and seemed to provide a lot of impact, but coming off the bench didn't just quite seem to work that way. I think a lot of people questioning the decision given the impact that he has, and in terms of how that affects the SuperCoach scores, it will be interesting to see how he performs in this game. But we'll have to wait and see how he goes. It would be concerning if he does get straight back to the bench when Carrigan comes back. So for owners, definitely one to be watching out for this week. So the first game on the Friday will be the Warriors taking on the Manly Sea Eagles. Not too many changes again here for the Warriors. The key ones here being that Adam Fanua-Blake had picked up that knee injury and is out of the side this week, and Bunty Afol picking up a 2 week ban. So in replacement, Kane Evans will take his place on the bench along with Tom Ale. Tohu Harris then moves into the starting prop position, and Jazz Tavanga moves into the starting lock role. What will be interesting to see is how Tohu Harris performs playing at the prop position. I think he did play there a few times last season, and I don't think really it affects his overall point scoring. He already kind of plays in the middle. What I would expect is that he still probably plays around 70 minutes. Obviously, that probably actually potentially means he'll have more early runs at the start of the game, and then as the game goes on, he might move and shift to an edge or maybe back into the lock role once, say, Jazz Tavanga has a spell. So it will be quite interesting to see how he performs, but I still think he's looking a really solid buy, and I wouldn't really be too off-put by his move to prop. In terms of the Sea Eagles, not too many changes here. Morgan Boyle has picked up an injury, so he's out of the side, as well as Moses Suli. So as a result, Toa Sipley moves on to the bench, and in replacement, and Morgan Harper will fill in for Moses Suli in the centre wing spot, and Jack Kazeski moves back into the starting second row. Good news for Josh Schuster owners is that he looks to be pretty safe at the moment in that starting edge role, given that he's listed at 5'8", not the ideal position for him to be listed in, but he's still scoring pretty well in base. So I think anyone who did jump on him last week, he should be looking to go up in price again, and I still think he's a pretty solid buy option this week, given that he's got a negative break even. Aside from that, though, not too many other changes with the Sea Eagles, and to be honest, I don't think many people are going to be looking at the Sea Eagles in general, just given the way that they're performing at the moment. So the next game on the Friday night will be the Panthers taking on the Raiders. Fortunately for the Panthers, they're 1-17, and they just seem to be firing on all cylinders, and no injury concerns for them at the moment. Obviously, I think the question marks will still be whether Stephen Crichton should be the number one instead of, say, Charlie Staines, who looked quite comfortable there in that little brief period in the game last week where he played at fullback. But Matt Burton still retains the centre wing position, and he looks a really interesting prospect. And obviously you've got the big guns like Brian To'o, Luai, Cleary, who've all performed really well to begin the season. And then guys like Kurt Capel, who a lot of people would have in their centre wing position. Again, I don't expect any drop off in terms of the way that they're performing. They are just coming up against a pretty tough side in the Raiders. In terms of the Raiders, not too many changes with them either. Joe Tarpane has recovered from his ankle problem and is now named to start at 13, with Dynamis Louis dropping to the reserves. Ryan James does move back to the bench after getting given the nod to start last week, and Ryan Sutton has been rewarded with another starting position. He is looking a really interesting prospect as well, given that he scored tries in his first 2 games. And it does seem that Ricky Stewart definitely seems to be the kind of coach who does reward his players if they do well for him. Similar to how Ryan James has had a good start to the season, and last week, he was given the nod to start, coming up against his old team. In terms of the rest of the side, the backline is all unchanged. Bailey Simonson obviously is probably a cheapy centre wing that all of us, or quite a lot of us, would have. Hasn't really set the world alight. He's just been kind of ticking along in the mid-30s. Just hopefully he gets a few more attacking stats and hopefully you can get a few more price rises out of him. So the next game of the round will be the Titans versus the Knights. Titans, really not that many changes. The big one for them is the inclusion of Brian Kelly back into the side. Anthony Don has picked up a bit of a knock, so Philip Sammy does move on to his wing position. I would expect that when Anthony Don does return from injury, though, that Philip Sammy will be the one to make way. The re-inclusion of Brian Kelly is a really good sign for the Titans. Obviously, I think preseason he was quite a popular pick in a lot of people's centre wing positions, given how the Titans finished the season last year, and he was putting up some good numbers last year in terms of his base and also his attacking stats, and he has got good tackle breaking ability as well. The Titans games coming up are quite good, so he looks a real interesting buy, not necessarily one I'd jump on straight away given that he's just returning from an injury, but someone to definitely wait and see on. In terms of the rest of the team, all unchanged, and having that kind of stability will be good for them moving forward. The only real question mark, I guess, for them will be Jamal Fogarty, who did pick up that calf injury last game. He's probably a bit touch and go. At the moment, he's looking as my kind of trade out for the week. Obviously, he might still play, but given that he's got that 0, I just don't think he's going to be, worth the money that he is at the moment. And we've got ready-made replacements in Sam Walker waiting in the wings, and that will create some more money in my team. So he's someone I'm probably looking to sell this week, and I don't really begrudge anyone from selling him either. In terms of the Knights, obviously a lot of changes here given the kind of carnage that they underwent through last game. The biggest inclusion obviously here will be the return of Kalen Ponga, probably music to the ears of any Knights fans. I think they've been waiting to get their star fullback back. But they've had to cop a lot of other injuries to big players in their side. Mitch Pearce, Kerman and Tex Hoy all out of the side this week. Mitch Pearce obviously has got that pec injury and that he's looking to be out potentially for I think 10 to 12 weeks. And Kerman picked up that nasty head knock, and Tex Hoy also with that injury problem. Any owners of Tex Hoy, obviously at this time he probably looks to sell given that Ponga has returned. So he's done his job, he's made some money, but it's probably time to offload him either down to a cheap 5'8", potentially like a Josh Schuster, or if you can stretch up to a gun 5'8". Blake Green will take the Knight spot number 7, so I don't think there should be too much of a dramatic decrease in their kind of playmaking ability. Obviously Ponga returning really helps, and Blake Green, he's a pretty steady number 7. David Clement has been named, but he did pick up that injury, so he's definitely someone to be waiting and seeing if he does get named into the the final match day squad. Connor Watson does get named at 5'8". Not quite sure what that will do to his kind of point scoring ability. Fortunately enough, he's got a low enough break even that we can still expect another few cash rises out of him, hopefully. But I would probably prefer him playing in the forwards. Obviously his PPM would probably be a little bit higher playing in that role. But at 5'8", he's obviously got, he's quite a quality player. He's got good ball playing and, good running ability. So he still has the opportunity to get some points. And the Knights draw still is pretty decent for the next few games coming up. What I am interested to see as well is the emergence of Ponga and how that impacts Mitch Barnett. Obviously I'd expect with Ponga, the Knights attack will probably maybe get directed a bit more to their left side. And hopefully that does mean good news for Mitch Barnett and hopefully a few more attacking stats for him. The one thing I am slightly concerned about though is the Chris Randall on the number 14. He traditionally I think does play at hooker, and I don't know if potentially that means that Jaden Brayley might not be an 80-minute hooker, but I'm not quite familiar with how the rotation will work with Chris Randall on the bench there. That was just kind of the first thought that I had to mind. In terms of the inclusions with the Knights team, Pasami Saulo and Brodie Jones also are added to the bench to make up the holes in the Knights with the Knights injuries. So the next game of the round will be the Bulldogs taking on the Storm in what looks like it's going to be another cricket score kind of game, just the way that the two teams are performing opposite ends of the spectrum. A lot of changes with the Bulldogs, which is never really a good sign for a team that's struggling. You always want to kind of have some stability. Dallin Watene-Zelezniak does return, comes in at fullback for the injured Nick Meaney. Lachlan Lewis is also out of the team after picking up that pretty bad head knock, with Jake Averillo returning in that place in the halves. Luke Thompson is also back from his kind of first 4-week suspension, as well as Josh Jackson from his suspension. That does see Dean Britt and Joe Stimson move out of the Bulldogs side. Again, to be honest with the Bulldogs, there's not too much interest that I have in their team at the moment, the way that they're performing. Definitely not any of their attacking players. They're not able to score any real points, and coming up against one of the best defenses in the Storm, it would be very easy to see them score another 0 this round. Obviously, you probably would expect a lot of defensive work from the middle guys like, say, Josh Jackson, so he's still looking like a pretty decent hold if you did have him, but I don't really see too much upside from him. Jack Hetherington still has retained his kind of starting front row forward role, but with the re-inclusion of Luke Thompson, we'll have to kind of see how the minutes shape up, but to be honest, not really too interested in really anyone at the Bulldogs at the moment. With the Storm, the obvious notable inclusion here is Harry Grant back in the reserves, and he potentially looks to be a potential match day inclusion in the Storm game against the Bulldogs. Apart from that, in their starting lineup, Felice Kafusi does return from his suspension and replaces Tom Eisenhuth, who does move now back onto the bench. The emergence of Harry Grant back with the Storm is a big plus for them. Obviously Brandon Smith is a more than capable replacement at number 9, but Harry Grant, in my opinion, is just on a different level, to be honest. That potentially does spell good news for the likes of Cam Munster, Jerome Hughes and Ryan Pappenhausen, now that they've got their primary number 9 back in the side. Obviously he's not quite named yet in the starting lineup, but do keep an eye out on the matchday squads. He might potentially be an inclusion. That's definitely something I'd be keeping an eye out, something I'll touch on a little bit later as well, because if he is listed to play at number 9, that really then will probably sway me to the Storm boys as potential captain options for this week. But apart from that, there's not too many other changes with the Storm. Very settled team, and coming up against this Bulldogs team with a lot of new faces rejoining the side, it just seems like this game is only going to go one way, and that points to a Storm blowout. So the next game will be the Roosters taking on the Sharks. With the Roosters, again, no changes to report on there, 1-17. Obviously, everyone will be keeping another close eye on Sam Walker. He looked very impressive, obviously, in that first game. Really looked like he was growing into the match. At the start, it felt like Teddy was trying to really force his hand to an extent. Obviously, I think he was just trying to really kind of spur the attack on. And Sam Walker was kind of just, letting him do his thing. And then I think as the game went, he kind of grew a bit more into the game, got involved with a couple of try assists as well, and really felt his way. And it looked really, good sign of maturity actually for someone on their debut. Good signs for the Roosters moving forward. And he's looking the cheapie of the week and potentially the cheapie of the season. And he obviously scored big with that 81. So he's definitely someone I'm going to be looking to bring in this week or next week. Apart from that, no other changes for the Roosters. Moving on to the Sharks, the only change here is that Jesse Ramian has returned from suspension as well. And he replaces Connor Tracy in the centres. Connor Tracy then moving on to the bench, and Braden Trindle then coming out of the 17. The Sharks have actually performed pretty well, above my expectations actually. Defensively, they've actually looked quite solid. They almost won against the Raiders, but just some goal kicking let them down. And they were right in it against the Eels, but their defensive just kind of worn down after the Eels kept applying a lot of pressure towards the back end of the game, and the scoreline didn't really reflect their true performance. And obviously they blew out the Cowboys last week. So there are some interesting options in their side in terms of, say, like Will Kennedy, Matt Moylan, for example, Teague Wilton, who is kind of emerging potentially as a good cheap second row forward option. Apart from that, there's not really too many other players I'm really interested in still at the moment with the Sharks, and it is kind of hard to fit in those guys that I just mentioned, except for maybe Teague Wilton, given the kind of pecking order that they're in. So for example, Will Kennedy at fullback, it's really hard to fit him in. And Matt Moylan, obviously he's looking like he'll probably still have a couple of price rises in him, but not for too much longer. I think a lot of people will be probably looking to sell and upgrade into a gun 5'8", or maybe downgrading potentially to a Josh Schuster if they didn't get that trade in last week. But apart from that, not too many changes with the Sharks, and it's quite hard to call this game. Obviously I'd probably tip a Roosters win, but I don't think it's going to be quite as big as a win as maybe people are expecting. The Sharks have shown to be pretty solid in defense, and the Roosters are still kind of gelling in terms of the new halves combination as well. So I don't think this game will be too big of a blowout, but I think the Roosters will take this game. So the next game of the round will be the Tigers taking on the Cowboys. Not too many changes for the West Tigers, the only one being that Asa Kapoa has been dropped out of the 17, and Michael Cheekham takes his place on the bench. As a result of that, Moses Mbai then moves on to the centre position, kind of showing his utility value. That does mean good news for Jacob Little. He looks potentially set to play 80 minutes, with the only caveat that Jake Simpkin has been named in the extended reserves. The only thing that I can think of is potentially that Jake Simpkin might be a late call-up into the starting 17 to give Little a bit of a spell. That would be really interesting option, given that Jake Simpkin is 173k hooker option, so a lot of people would be looking to potentially downgrade to him if he does end up getting some game time in the next few weeks. But Little has showed that he can play 80 minutes, so I'm not I wouldn't bet my house on Simpkin getting a run in the 17. So at the moment, Little is still looking like a good hold. He scored the 73 last week, and he's done pretty well in the first 4 games of the season, and the next few games of the Tigers are looking pretty good as well. So the big thing here for the Cowboys is the re-inclusion of Jason Taumalolo into the starting lineup. Really good news for the Cowboys. Things have been looking quite dire at the moment, but Taumalolo hopefully should offer some good go forward for them, which hopefully gives some more opportunities to their backline players. Obviously, he still had that question mark over his minutes, given that he was playing pretty low minutes in comparison to what he has been in the past few years. Maybe potentially he might get an increase on those, given that they look like they really do need that presence from him. But we'll wait and see how his minutes shape up. At the moment, I wouldn't be looking to buy him. I'd be waiting and seeing on how his minutes are. The other inclusion will be Kyle Felt from his suspension. Justin O'Neill then moves out of the side, given that he's picked up a knock, I think. But apart from that, there's no other changes really at the Cowboys to touch on. In terms of the Cowboys, I think they actually have a few decent games coming up, including this one against the Tigers. But until I see their attack clicking, it's really hard to kind of invest in any of their players. The ones to keep an eye out on, I guess, are Val Holmes. He's been ticking along pretty decently. And Ben Condon, who did, I think he is a 173k or 185k second row forward cheapie. He only scored, I think, around 35 though in 80 minutes, so that is a bit concerning. So we'll have to wait and see, and hopefully his work rate does improve before looking to potentially get him in as a cheapie in that position. So the final game of the round is the Eels taking on the Dragons. Obviously, the big news here for the Eels is that Ryan Matterson has been named, although that was the case last week, and he was actually omitted in the final match day squad, which would have been really frustrating, I think, for owners. The big question mark, I guess, with Madison owners is whether you hold him or sell him. I'll probably give further thoughts on that in my trade thoughts video. But at the moment, it seemed that what it was last week was that he was right to go, but they were just being a bit extra cautious with him, which was a good sign. But there is, again, a big risk that, given that the Eels are playing the last game of the round again, if he's a late inclusion, you don't really have too many other kind of reserves that you can play instead of him. So you really kind of, I think, potentially have to make a call on him before its first lockout. The other big news is Bryce Cartwright moving into the 17, but as a result, Keegan Hipgrave and Ray Stone move out of the 17. Apart from that, the Eels are looking pretty solid, and I'd probably expect them to get another win here to, keep their season with a perfect record at the moment. With the Dragons, again, not many changes here. The only ones being that Jack Bird is back from his suspension, and Jackson Ford does move out of the 17. Been pretty impressed, to be honest, with the Dragons. They've shown a bit of heart in their last few games, and I'm actually expecting quite a decent game. I think the Eels will take this one. But there are definitely some players to note here. Mainly, I'd say Zach Lomax, given that with that 41 from last week, hopefully his price does start to decrease, and we can pick him up a little bit later. There is going to be a point, I think, in the next month or after the next month, where the Dragons' draw does really improve, and he could then be a good pickup at that point in time. But apart from that, no other changes with the Dragons, and that does round up the team list for this round. So I kind of wanted to touch on the captains and vice captains in this part of the team list video. Moving forward, I'm kind of looking to maybe keep those team list section of the video a little bit shorter, and hopefully touch a little bit more on the captains and do a separate video on the trade thoughts. So I would really appreciate some feedback as well if you guys do kind of prefer this format. In terms of the vice captains for this round, I think the obvious one, given that the Rabbitohs are playing on the Thursday, will be guys like Damien Cook and Latrell Mitchell. Damien Cook obviously performed really well against the Bulldogs last week, just absolutely carving out through the middle, and the Broncos looked really soft up through the middle last week against the Storm, with Pappenhausen and even Justin Olam really damaging in that part of the field. So I'd expect Damien Cook to potentially have another big game this week. The Broncos have been relatively okay last season, actually defending the hooker position, kind of being mid-table. But, obviously I think the quality of Damien Cook is going to be better than almost all the other hookers in the game. So I expect him to have a really good game this week as well. Looking at the kind of track record of the first 4 weeks though, he's gone kind of low and then big. So on that basis, he's going for a low scoring game, but I feel like this game might be the one that bucks that trend. He only averaged 42 last season against the Broncos, but it probably is a case where I think this could be an outlier game and he could do really well. Latrell is obviously going to be another good vice captain option. Fullbacks, Broncos are actually the worst team at conceding points to. We obviously saw last week Ryan Pappenhausen score an immense 197 against them, and there's no reason why Latrell can't quite get over the 100-point mark as well. So he's looking a very good vice captain option. Potentially there is that absence of Cody Walker, and that might impact the Rabbitohs' attack, but that potentially also does mean that Latrell will get his hand on the ball more often than not. And Benji Marshall, I expect, would probably be quite good at feeding the ball to him. So he potentially might get a lot of attacking stats here, a lot of tries. So I'd expect he might even run over a couple of tries himself. So I'd probably have a safe bet that he potentially might get over that 100 to 110 point mark. So he's looking a really good option, I think, for a vice captain this week. Next up, in terms of the captains, I really wanted to put both the Storm boys here, so I've put little mini-me versions of them. Obviously, Ryan Papenhuyzen, we know what he did last week. I don't really think I need to speak about that too much more. In terms of how the Bulldogs actually defended against fullbacks last season, they were the 4th worst team in that position last year. And in terms of the 5'8", they were the 3rd worst. So that does spell good news for the likes of Papenhuyzen and Munster. And as I touched on previously, with Harry Grant potentially maybe getting into that side, maybe if he does come off the bench, I think that really will spark their attack. And that probably does spell good news to Papenhuyzen and Munster, and I could see both of them, going well over the 90 point mark. Munster probably hasn't performed as a lot of people would have hoped, but he's still kind of ticking along with like close to a 70 point average, and that doesn't even look like he's been doing too well. So I think, he's primed for a big game. It might not come against the Bulldogs, but I think he's still going to be potentially a very safe captain option, or even a vice captain if you don't quite want to captain him. The next captain option I wanted to discuss was Dave Fifita coming up against the Knights. Obviously the Knights have been hammered with injuries, so potentially that does spell better news for Dave Fifita playing on an edge against them. The Knights were not great at defending against edge positions last season. They were the 6th worst team, and Dave Fifita has just looked in like unbeatable form. The way that he's running at the moment, scored 88 last week against a very good Raiders pack. We know what he's done against slightly worse teams. So Fifita looks to be a great option for a captain, punt this week. The way that he's running, the base and power that he's getting about 60 to 7 points in base and power, and that just means kind of tackles his runs, but also his tackle breaks and his offloads. So he's potentially looking like a great captain option for this week. It wouldn't really be a captain video without touching on Damian Tedesco. He could be a little bit of a pod captain this week, because I think the Sharks defense has actually looked quite good, but they were the 4th worst team at defending fullbacks last season, and Teddy, in my opinion, is the number 1 fullback. So I think he could go well above that last week's score of only the 74 we say, but Tedesco, for him, his standards, we're looking at 100-point games from him. I haven't quite decided whether I'm going to go. I'm kind of at the moment flipping between Papenhuyzen and Tedesco. Part of me really does want to go back to Papenhuyzen again, just knowing what he did last week against the Bulldogs, who are looking a lot worse than the Sharks. He could be the option to go for, but obviously I wouldn't begrudge anyone to go for Teddy this week. I think that argument that I had said last week about him potentially being a good captain for that week, given that he wasn't as highly captained, does spell true, I think, again this week. But I think this week could be a slightly better argument, given that he now has had that one game with that new halves combination. So I think he could do really well here as well. So next up, I've got 2 kind of really, really punty captain options if you're really wanting to go outside the box. I've got David Nofaluma, who hasn't really set the world alight at the moment, but he's coming against the Cowboys, and they were the 2nd worst team at defending wingers last season. And he's obviously, we know what he's done last year, and I kind of feel like there's going to be one of those breakout games for him where he's going to go massive, score a double, and combined with his good base, might go over 100. And I think against the Cowboys, who are not looking very good on the edge defenses at the moment, I think he potentially could be the one who goes big this week. He's only scored the 39 last week, but against the Cowboys, he did perform pretty well last season, averaging 78. So I think he could be, a real out the box punt captain option if you do own him. Like that, we're talking real point of difference, because at the moment I don't think he's very heavily owned as it is. So if you do own him and you really want to go there, you potentially could throw the captain on him. I would advise with caution doing that. No, but if you've potentially got the vice captain on a lot safer option like a Teddy or a Papenhuyzen, you could go Nofaluma, as they are playing on the very last game of the round, so you can have that opportunity to vice captain a Papenhuyzen, a Teddy, or even like a Damien Cook, for example. So if you really want to go the pod move, you could go with Nofaluma this week. And finally, we've got Reed Marnie. Coming up against the Dragons, they are actually pretty good at defending against the hooker position. There were only 3 other teams better at defending the hooker position than the Dragons last season. But Reed Marnie, he looks like he's taken his game to a whole new level. His kicking game looks to be better. He looks to be a lot more involved in the attacking plays for the Eels. And he's coming off against a 100-point game last week. And I think in those 4 games, he's got 2 tons. So he's looking the goods at the moment. And he could be a really good punt captain option as well if you do have him. I think at the moment, I don't think a lot of people actually still own him. Obviously, he's been very popular. But putting the captain on him, I think, would be a real hot, solid pod move. No, I don't know if I'd quite go there myself. Obviously, I don't own him, so I can't do that anyway. I'd probably be more keen to stick it on to like the Papenhuyzen or the Teddys. But again, similar to the Nofaluma logic, if you want to go really, really pod, I think Reed Marnie could be a really strong pod captain option this week. Guys, that's the video. We've gone through the team list Tuesday for round 5, as well as my picks for potential vice captain and captain options. Would really appreciate if you guys did let me know if you do like this kind of format, combining these two. And I will be doing a separate video on trade thoughts, going through player prices and the break evens. Panthers, as well as the different teams and their draws coming up. So do stay tuned for that one coming out in the next few days. But if you guys did like this video, would really appreciate a thumbs up. Please do consider subscribing as well if you're new around here, as I'll continue to put out more videos like this throughout the 2021 SuperCoach season. Until then, I'll see you guys in the next one.